We've been listening to President Biden speak at the UN General Assembly. The president stressing partnership here, stressing repeatedly our future is bound to yours, and renewing the U.S. commitment to various global causes and to supporting Ukraine. For more, I want to bring in ABC News Chief White House correspondent Mary Bruce, ABC News political director Rick Klein, and ABC's Jay O'Brien on Capitol Hill. Mary, this was a speech made to world leaders, but some of it felt like it was also directed to leaders here at home. Who was the president trying to connect with here?
Both. Look, he is obviously making a very forceful pitch to our allies around the world, speaking repeatedly about global unity, as you note. But the president is also directing this at a domestic audience, especially when it comes to the issue of the war in Ukraine. While the president didn't lead straight off the bat with those calls for, to keep up the fight there, he did get there. And that is sort of the culmination of this speech. And that is a message that is very much aimed to Republicans on Capitol Hill right now, where we are seeing support for this war wane. You are seeing many Republicans right now in this current funding fight. They don't want to fund the war, or they want to lessen the amount of funding. Some even say that it shouldn't be funded at all by the U.S. The president making an argument about the long game here, that this isn't just about the U.S., this isn't just about Ukraine, this is about, a long fight for democracy around the world, and that this is a fight that the U.S. has to keep up, has to continue to fund going forward.
Rick, he also said we need to be able to break the gridlock on the council. What do you make of that, given the backdrop of a looming potential government shutdown here at home in Washington?
Yeah, it's a different kind of gridlock, and I think the fact that you've got the Chinese, the Russians with their veto power on the Security Council, that is a force that is more immovable than even the right now dysfunctional Republicans in Washington. I think the president has to be cognizant of the example that his own democracy sets, and it's not just the government shutdown; it's the constant brinksmanship in Washington. It's the relitigation of various facets over the functioning of democracy. It's the multiple impeachments of his predecessor. All of that is something that others are paying attention to. Vladimir Putin himself has talked about how the current state of American democracy makes his argument easier on the world stage. And we know that there are countries that are working together against the United States' interests, taking advantage of perceived weaknesses in democracy. But I think this president knows the power of his own example out there. He knows the power of this moment. He knows the power of this audience. And these issues that he is lobbying on, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's workers' rights at the looming strike here at home among U.S. auto workers, all of these are very much things that are tied into the functioning of the U.S. economy and the world economy, and something that President Biden is mindful of as he heads into the next 14 months before his reelection.
Jay, I want to ask you first, how do you expect those messages to land on Capitol Hill?
Well, Congress is divided on this. Republicans in Congress are divided on continued aid for Ukraine, as Mary just alluded to. The White House has asked Congress for a supplemental in Ukraine funding, $24 billion additional dollars to go to fund Ukraine in its defense against Russia. In the Senate, we've seen Republicans get strongly behind additional funding for Ukraine. Chief among them is Mitch McConnell, the top Republican in the Senate. Over in the House side, there are some House Republicans who are behind additional funding for Ukraine. Mike McCall is one. He's the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. But then there is this vocal group of House Republicans who have said, as Mary pointed out, A, some of them don't want any additional funding for Ukraine. B, some of them want to reduce the funding. Or C, some of them want additional, what they would view as safeguards on funding for Ukraine, additional observation as to where the money goes, et cetera, et cetera. Even Speaker McCarthy has said he wants some version of that in the past. And case in point here, we know that this fight for Ukrainian funding is linked to the government funding fight, whether or not they would attach any additional Ukrainian funding to a bill to fund the government. And right now, when Republicans drafted their proposal to kick the can down the road and fund the government while they have this broader funding fight, there wasn't any Ukrainian aid inside that proposal. So that's a snapshot of what House Republicans think right now, that this is an issue that they don't want to tackle.
Mary, the president also said that the world lost ground in the past few years in the wake of COVID-19, conflicts, other crises, and that the U.S. is committed to doing its part to get us back on track. Is that an attempt just to put on people's radar what the U.S. has already done, or is he preparing the world for more funding?
It's a little bit of both, I think. He is trying to make the case, stick with us, we're going to get this done, right? But I think the president also is clear-eyed about the road ahead, right? This is not going to be easy. It's also a pitch that the president is making, of course, as he knows that he is, making this argument to world leaders on the global stage while he's also running for re-election. So he's trying to argue to these allies, to the domestic audience, here's the American plan. Here's how we're going to try and unite world leaders going forward. He downplayed a lot of the areas of conflict, downplaying, tension with China notably, and saying, this is our plan. This is what we're hoping to get accomplished, and stick with us for another 4 years.
Rick, he also touched on climate change. How big of an issue could that be in the coming election, and how much of that was aimed at the U.S. audience as well?
I think he knows that it's key for a political constituency. It's also key for the state of the world. And I think the president has talked about this in very broad and critical terms. Obviously, his election ushered in a new approach from that of his predecessor. He's also, though, aware of the debate on the Republican side about even beyond the existence of climate change, which, of course, is a settled matter, but what should be done about it. Vivek Ramaswamy, one of the Republican candidates, saying there was nothing he would do to address climate change from the federal perspective. There's a lot of disappointment on the political left in the climate community about how the president has handled this. The fact that he hasn't declared a national emergency around the climate has come up in this era of strengthening storms. And we know from polling that it's of a particular issue and importance, particularly to younger voters. I think for the president to continue to tout achievements on this, whether they're legislative or on the world stage, will be an important part of the messaging. But of course, we know that we're very much not alone on this question. Maybe above all else, that whatever the U.S. does has to have partners in the world community, or there really is literally nothing that can be done to address it. So it's only with the cooperation and with the shared vision of some of the fellow world leaders in that room that any progress at all can be made in trying to address climate change and trying to hit some of the targets that the world community and scientists have let out.
And Jay, the president also mentioned working together to responsibly develop AI. What could that look like?
Well, that's the open question. We know here in Congress is working on some kind of AI safeguards and AI regulation, but the timeline of how Congress is going to tackle this is unclear. So short of a new law governing AI, or at least reframing of existing laws around AI, the White House has been taking the lead. And what the White House has been doing is saying to AI companies and companies that are heavily invested in AI, like Meta, like Google, et cetera, join this voluntary list of safeguards around artificial intelligence. That's what the White House is doing. In Europe, they have much stricter AI regulations, and one of the things Congress is looking at is they believe Europe went too far with those regulations and stifled development to the point where you didn't foster the growth of AI and you only tamped it down out of concerns of what could happen. So there's this patchwork of AI laws across the globe, and there's a conversation being had at global bodies like the UN about what can be done. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to individual countries and legislative bodies in each of those individual countries, like the United States Congress, to put together what laws they want to put forward, kind of like how social media is regulated across the globe. The question then becomes, if you've got this patchwork of laws and some are different and some go this way and some go that way, what does that mean for broader AI development? And the reality is we're just too early in this process for anyone to have a good answer to that, including the president.
Mary, President Biden also reiterated that Iran should never acquire a nuclear weapon. What do you make of the timing of that, given the administration just cut this deal to have Iran release 5 American detainees?
Yeah, and we have seen the administration, we've seen White House officials really try to respond, to be very vocal in response to that criticism surrounding this deal. And much of that criticism, of course, is around the fact that the U.S. agreed to release the $6 billion in Iranian oil revenue that had been held up by U.S. sanctions. Now, the administration is making the point very vocally and forcefully that just because they reached this deal to release these 5 Americans who are held for years in captivity, it is not a sign, the White House argues, in any way, shape, or form that they are somehow easing up on Tehran. They are not somehow, there's no softening of U.S. relations with Iran going on here. So the president coming out and forcefully saying they are committed, of course, to preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. In light of that deal, I think it's a message they wanted to make sure that the president was able to hammer home.
You also mentioned China before. He used some interesting language there, saying that he is for de-risking, not decoupling when it comes to China. Translate that. What do you think he means by that?
In Biden speak, he is trying to emphasize that, There has been a lot of attention put on, especially the president's recent trip to the G20 in India, his recent trip to Vietnam, a lot of focus on the efforts that the U.S. has been making to try and counter the rise of China. The president has tried to push back on some of that, arguing, look, they aren't trying to, there's no new Cold War. This is about, creating a stable base in the Indo-Pacific. This isn't about, somehow trying to tamp down China. They're trying to walk a very fine line here because obviously China isn't, we have important economic relations with China, but there is no question that the U.S. is taking steps, shoring up other alliances, trying to make sure that the U.S. has strong partnerships to counter some of China's aggression.
And Rick, of course, the big issue, we already touched on it, but it feels worthy to go back to it, especially since it was the end of the president's speech talking about Ukraine. He really wanted to get that message across, saying if we allow Ukraine to be carved up, is the independence of any nation secure? How well do you think that message is expected to land, not only with world leaders, but, as you and Jay pointed out, with lawmakers in Washington, some of whom do not want to keep funding this war?
Yeah, there's a lot of levels to that portion of the speech. Obviously, the world leaders have all heard the argument before, but the power coming from the American president was speaking about it in those kind of frank terms about really their own interest in seeing the Ukrainians succeed in this struggle. The Security Council, the United Nations itself, is a bit of a different animal because Russia and China remain opposed to the United States in so many of these areas. It is hard to get real traction out of the UN. That really isn't what this is about. It is about rallying the world community. And yes, back home, we are seeing a real split, as Jay mentioned earlier, inside the Republican Party about the issue of Ukraine. You've got Mitch McConnell, the top Senate Republican, who almost every day goes to the Senate floor and talks about the importance of maintaining strength for the mission. You have Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, who not only can't get his own conference together for funding that might or might not include Ukraine, he may not even be meeting with Zelensky when he's in Washington, D.C. later in the week. So these divisions that are playing out on the presidential campaign trail inside the Republican Party are also critical to defining what Biden has brought to American leadership. Keep in mind the misplaying or the mishandling of start of the Afghanistan withdrawal was a critical moment that hurt the president and the president's standing. Ukraine is still an open question.
All right, Rick Klein, Mary Bruce, Jay O'Brien, thank you all.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.